At the core of any piece of academic work is some sense of concern, a contention, a wondering, an assertion, a question. There is, in short, a purpose, and which underpins the logic which evolves to become a methodology. After all, before we can devise a strategy for investigation or exploration, we must first arrive at a sense of what it is we want to answer or understand. Only then can we articulate a systematic way of addressing that concern. I would therefore suggest that any thinking around methodology must begin with a really serious consideration of focus, in two distinct ways. The first aspect is to do with locus and range, a better consideration of what the central concern might be, and what the end understanding will encompass. In thinking about this dimension, you should also think very carefully about what you don't intend to cover, the boundaries of your aspirations, what's work for today and what's work for future projects. Often, the impulse in this dimension is to cast one's net as broadly as possible, particularly where we're engaged in substantial pieces of work with hefty word counts. I would urge the listener to resist this impulse, and instead to refine and narrow their focus as much as possible. A tighter set of intents enables us to give more of a substantial focus to them, to really pull them apart in sustained and critical ways, and thus to arrive at more productive understandings. In the process of arriving at these understandings, we can often find that our focus exposes complexities and interlinks, and thus breadth evolves as a product of depth. The second aspect to consider in interrogating your academic intents is the kinds of language you're using to express them, and the ways in which this begins to establish theoretical assumptions about the nature of what we're studying. Consider, for instance, the difference between these two expressions of the same interest. The first couches the project as a matter of establishing proof, and in doing so, makes some very particular commitments to absolute and concrete outcomes with a strong burden of evidence. As such, it begins to commit to a sense of objective and precise measurement, in this case, of achievement. And this implicates a particular set of methods of investigation. Similarly, the question implies a relationship between two variables in which one causes the other, and hence commits methodologically to orchestrate tests of the strength of this relationship. But they're important to pin down initially, as they help to structure your approach and the way in which you talk about answers. Finally, more positivistic studies, those which apply a more scientific methodology, might transpose their aims into a set of hypotheses. These are more direct, assertive statements, which predict particular outcomes, and which the study seeks to either accept or reject. Having interrogated and articulated your intents, you'll have undertaken the most important step in your journey towards methodology, encapsulating what it is that you want to know, and beginning to form a sense of the qualities that answer might take. Developing this into a practical strategy will involve consideration of three broad subsequent themes. One of these themes is the theoretical nature of the work. As I've suggested in this podcast, the questions you ask will bring with them particular philosophical alignments to, for instance, positivism or interpretivism. These, in turn, will have implications for how you proceed in your investigation, the methods you use to gather data and to analyse it, for instance. I'll explore this in more detail in a later podcast. A second, and perhaps most direct theme, relates to the practical constraints surrounding the project, what it's possible to do in addressing your intents within the time available, the material resources, your own expertise, and the places and people to whom you have access. Thirdly, you'll want to consider the ethical and political implications of how you address your intents, the rights and wrongs of how you work with people and institutions, and the impacts your findings might have on them. This is a dimension which is often treated as subsequent to initial methodological design, but it's something that I'd encourage the listener to interrogate from the very earliest of stages. I'll offer more guidance on this in a separate podcast. So we've seen in this podcast that intents and interests, and the ways in which we express them, are fundamental to appreciating methodology. As an academic practitioner then, an active grappling with them is always fundamental and foundational.